Hi, Jim Heffron. Just to identify, this presentation is being given for the 2020 Tech Users Group Annual Conference. Just if you happen to stumble across it on the web and wonder what the heck this is about. Okay, I want to talk about a first set of LaTeX packages, and let me bring my window up. There we go. The idea here is that I want to have a small list, two sides of a page, a small list of packages that cover most of what beginners want to do. You want to name one and kind of only one package in each area, and the idea, of course, is that you want that a person can bookmark this or somehow may print out a copy, somehow have a go-to list that they can rely on when they have a problem. They run their finger down the list and say, aha, there is a kind of a way to solve footnote questions, or at least as a first tool to reach to solve footnote questions. Okay. At the 2019 annual conference, I reported on a project of mine to use social media, namely Reddit, to help understand the needs of today's beginners. Of course, as always has been, often exactly what they need is just to be pointed to the right package. So I'm trying to develop a suitable set of packages that a person can keep by. The idea is to not be too small. If you only list 4 packages, that isn't enough, but not be too large either. If you list 400 packages, that's a paradox of choice. In hanging around sort of this particular group, the LaTeX subreddit on Reddit, you do find that people have trouble finding a good package, finding the right package. They sometimes pull up things that are obsolete. I just yesterday was answering a question from somebody, and they were using a package that it says in the description is obsolete, but I've been there before. You go to a place you're not familiar with, and there's a lot of words there, and you don't see the sort of magic word. So the idea is to have a list that a person would go to first. So 2 sides of a page, one package per problem, and the other criteria is in the distributions, basically means on CTAN, and largely bug-free. I intend to produce a PDF, an HTML, and a video, and obviously ultimately the PDF would go on CTAN. The purpose of this presentation is to solicit feedback from anybody who has a better idea than mine. Pretty common. If as I run through the list, if people say, no, wait, you're suggesting the wrong thing, then I'd be very interested in hearing that. Okay, so the document that I have, as I mentioned, consists of 2 sides of a page. The core of the document really consists of just a couple of sections that classify the different areas. Front matter, back matter, the kind of stuff. And then the actual package list is not actually bullet points, but really it's bullet points without the bullet points. So you just have a list of names. Each name is a hyperlink, and each gets a terse description, something like, for captions, use caption kind of thing. There also have a couple of comments in parentheses in the document that often come up in conjunction with the recommendations. So for example, 6 times out of 10, when somebody asks about floats, they want to know how to get something to be right here. That is to say, they want to know about the H option. So rather than, it seemed like it would be remiss to not mention that. But in the presentation here, I omitted a lot of those side comments. Before the list is a small introduction just to get people started. The introduction mentions CTAN because CTAN is the target of the hyperlinks. The package names are hyperlinks. It also mentions using TechDoc to read the local documentation because I think that's a not well enough known tool. And finally, it notes that if you're writing for a journal or institution, if you're writing, say, a master's thesis, then you have to go looking to see if that place has their own package. Before you go out to make your own, you should see what they have. I included the CTAN graphic there, but I love this picture. CTAN is kind of our package store, I wasn't going to include a picture, except that I found that this is a terrific package store. CTAN is a terrific package store, so I threw that in. Okay, so here's the set of packages. I'm just going to go through the list, not at a breakneck pace, but most of these will be familiar to most of the folks who are watching this. So I want to have a couple comments to make along the way, but I want to just simply give a person who is thinking what should be, what should not be while they're watching this, the list that's here, so you're not just guessing. Okay, so just to start here, the first section is every document. These are things that a person asks themselves for every document. Every document I open, I ask myself sort of, what about? And so item number one here is the geometry package. You'll notice before I go any further, of course, geometry is a link, and it's a link to CTAN. Let me see if I can get the link to work here. And turn the associated window on, bring it up. Whoops, come on, come to Papa. There we go. Bring it up to the top, there we go. And of course it links to the CTAN page for geometry. And I do want to point something out about the CTAN page. In addition to the documentation, which you have the documentation on your local machine, but you also have it on the web if you're interested. I think this is another example of something that's not well enough known, is these tags. They are often the way to find the answer that you're exactly looking for. Now, geometry in this case is a pretty exhaustive package, but some of the packages that come later, there are other packages that kind of do something like the same thing that a person might want instead. If you click on that tag, tag, you see, for example, A4 pages, A5 pages kind of stuff, and a person might very well say, oh, this is exactly what I was looking for. Okay, let me bring that window off. There we go, and back to the main window. Okay, multiple columns, of course. Obviously, LaTeX has a built-in mechanism for 2 columns, although there are some awkward things about it, like starting a new page. But anyway, LaTeX has a built-in mechanism for 2 columns, but multi-col is something that's sort of the definitive answer. Just like geometry, if somebody asks about multiple columns, you don't say to yourself, oh, I wonder, but a person would, if you were in Google or if you were in CTAN, you might have some trouble finding it. For significant amounts of mathematics, of course, a person does want to use the AMS packages, the AMS Math and the AMS SYMB, SIM, AMS, I don't know how to pronounce it. And I know there are other choices, but I personally use the AMS theorem for producing the theorem environments. I know there are other good ones, but that's what I personally use. And then I do have a couple of comments in the document about these. In particular, you don't need to load AMS fonts because this package loads it for you. But one that I think is very much worth mentioning is the math tools. AMS Math, of course, when a person Googles mathematics or LaTeX mathematics, that comes up. But Math Tools has a lot of stuff in there that I personally find very handy. Most of the time, not a week goes by without me using it, and I don't know how a beginner would know that. If you want to get, for example, ... evenly balanced between equal signs in an align environment, that's what you need. And so I think that's a good tip, that load Math Tools instead of AMS Math. So that's a good example of what I mean by a couple of side comments. And microtype, I'm not very sophisticated, that's for sure, and I can never see somebody will say, this looks so much better, and I'm sorry, I don't see it. But I do appreciate that that when I use microtype, I get many fewer bad lines. So I get that. Okay, so I throw that in. Okay, so this is sort of every document, and a person who was looking for the right package might say to themselves, I need something that applies globally. Okay, so I'll look there. Next up, a person, the biggest pile, a person might say, okay, well, I have a specific need in a document, and the first item, of course, is typical. We get a lot of questions from beginners. A lot of times people write in and say, I'm brand new. A lot of questions from beginners about lists. They'll say something like, I need for the list items to be in italic instead of boldface or something. Perfectly sensible. That's what they need. And so it seems to me, enum item, or however you pronounce it, would be absolutely the go-to package. And there are other packages that do other things, but if a person asks the question about how do I tweak lists, that's really the answer. captions, of course, and floating environments. And I mentioned in particular here earlier that I have in parentheses. I mentioned that if you want to override the automatic float placement system, that if you want to have a sort of here option, then that's what you reach for. I imagine everybody watching this, but not necessarily beginners, understand about hyperref. Not nearly well enough known is cleverref, or some kind of cleverref mechanism where where instead of getting LaTeX to print out 1.2, it will print out theorem 1.2, and if you go back and change it to a lemma, then the mechanism will change the word from theorem to lemma. I think that's, making these things automatic is a major goal of the system, and also, frankly, I don't know, a pleasure. It just seems right that the system can figure out that that's a lemma, because that's what computers are good for. And then URLs. I mention here file paths because I think that's a not well enough known technique for getting file paths. And I have folks do come in and ask questions about how do I get file paths, and you point out to them it's exactly the same mechanism as URLs. Code listings we get that question a lot. Beginners often ask about code listings. There's a lot of trade-offs here, and a person can choose, one package or another. At the moment, I use listings, and it does seem to me that listings is the most popular package, but it has a number of awkwardnesses, and I sometimes reach for minted. In particular, the whole parsing thing I just don't get it. So if I ever have to struggle with parsing, I often reach for minted, which is basically you get the full Python mechanism, and so it just seems to me easier. But listings does seem to me to be sort of the go-to package, the package that most people reach for first, and it's actually the one that I reach for first, and so that's what I put in. Another package that's kind of a hidden gem is to get single quotes inside verbatim text to come out correctly, straight up and down. Not some kind of weird slashy thing with this upquote package. To do code is how I do verbatim text. I never need to do anything else in verbatim text, so I'm talking about code here. For code in Python, there's the specific package, the Python tech, that again I don't know that it's well enough known, and you can make a computation and drop the computation into the document, and I've used that many times and found it very convenient. So in addition to showing the code listings for Python, you also have the capability of that entire programming language in your document writing, and that's again something that I don't know that a beginner has conceptualized. A person who is thinking about Word is not thinking of their system as a computation system. They're thinking of their system as kind of a blank page. But a person who thinks of kind of the LaTeX sort of tech environment as a computer program, as a computation system, as an executable environment, this seems natural in a way that it often doesn't seem natural to beginners. I use Python tech with some frequency. I often use Sage tech. In particular, I have a lab manual for undergraduate linear algebra course that's based around Sage tech, and it's an awful nice system. It, of course, formats the text, but it allows you to use Sage to produce all kinds of, I do a lot of matrix multiplications and matrix factorizations kind of stuff, and it drops it right into the document, so that's awfully nice. Okay, I put up a version of this document, earlier version of this document on social media, on Reddit, and asked folks for some comments. I got a couple of different comments, but the ones that are here are a lot of people talked about tables, and it absolutely is true that a lot of people write in with questions about tables. I don't know, when you think about the different questions that people ask, there's all kinds of different, I don't want to list 15 packages, it's just too much. Sometimes the right thing to do is to list one and say, and you should know there's more, and that's what I'm doing here. So multi-row is something people often ask. Breaking across pages is something also that people often ask. The one that I personally use, everybody has their favorite, and at some point you have to make a choice, so I chose the one I use. The one that I personally use the most is array, and of course it's in the standard distribution, LaTeX distribution. So I think that's an argument that it's perfectly standard and that it will be here sort of 5 years from that kind of stuff, and a tremendously valuable package. So I named it specifically. I also named the SI Unit X, I'm not sure how you pronounce that either, package, and put it in the same pile because one of the things it has is a table column type for aligning on a decimal point, which is an often asked questions. But this is of course more valuable than that alone. Is that it's excellent for doing scientific units. It does just the job that people seem to need. I'm not a natural scientist, so that's not something that I personally have much use for, but it's clear that folks think that's the package you want to reach. If that's your need, that's the package you want to reach for. That makes all the sense in the world. I write some textbooks, some undergraduate free textbooks, and so I often have to write boxes that are colored because they hold theorems. I personally use MD framed. I wanted to take this opportunity here to mention that when you make a list like this, of course, at some point you have to make some choices. You often hear named, in this case, to another package called a T-color box. I just have never used it. I've always been satisfied with MD framed, and I understand MD framed to still be kept up, still be very capable. So I named it as kind of the one to reach for because it's in the end it's a list I made, and so I named the things that I know. And finally, it's a little silly, but it's one that I use almost every day. I need to develop some filler text, and I'll tell you where I use it every day is that when I'm helping somebody, I very often say, here's a dummy document that shows how to make a list where the items are in italics, and so I use the filler text. Maybe not every beginner would use it, but I reach for that package all the time. Okay, graphics and color. So, of course, the standard graphics package. I have to say that there's, of course, one that ends with an S, and the right one to use is the one that ends with an X. I don't say that in the document, but I can see how a beginner would see a list and say, well, the one that's correctly spelled seems like the one to reach for. Anyway, I named the one that has an X in it. Very often, folks write in and say, I want to select part of another document. That's a very common question. One of the things about social media that I personally have often reflected on is that you see people asking not the question you'd think they'd ask. PDF pages struck me when I sort of first ran across it as not a ridiculous, but not the most important package. But this, how do I select 5 pages from another document? Comes up an awful lot as a question, and so I think it belongs in this list, and including video or sound, which is something that not enough people do, does not happen enough, but obviously there's a sort of a go-to package for that. Color. Color is an often asked question. I personally find the X color documentation, everybody's got opinions. My opinion is, what can you do besides share them? My opinion is that X color, the documentation is very hard to read. It's perfectly correct, and I can't understand it. So a person sometimes can do with a couple of good examples, but boy, it can do anything I've ever needed it to do. So that's the one that I reach for. In particular, it has an HTML color space and all kinds of things that I sometimes say to myself, I want to match that to the graphic that I pulled down off the web. So it's all perfect. Plots and graphics. Again, this is one of those things where a person has to make a choice, and so I personally made a choice here. I personally use asymptote. I think there are 3 things that occur to a person in this context, maybe 4. So asymptote, Tixi, PS tricks, and maybe a person would say metapost. I personally use asymptote, and so that's what I named. I had a bad experience a long time ago, 2001 or some such thing, where I had done things it was in PS Tricks, but I had done things where you draw the graphic inside the document. And I started getting reports that people couldn't compile my documents. And it turned out it was because they were using PDF. Anyway, the point is that if you compile the graphics inside the document, that's one more link in the chain that can go wrong. Anyway, I feel like I learned a lesson, and I compile the graphics outside the document. I find this system to be excellent, although I'm not a very talented graphic artist, so I sometimes draw pictures that are not optimal, but that's hardly the fault of the system. It is the case, however, it would be remiss of me not to mention TXI in this context, because that is, it seems to me, the great majority of people, that's the system that they use. And I can see why. It's a nice system. Okay, then front and back matter, headers and footers is a place, sort of the decorations around the basic work. Okay, so title sec, page headers and footers, really that's the go-to. Table of contents, again, go-to package. Answers, I use answers all the time. It has been doing what it's needed to do for 20 years anyhow. I use FootMISC for footnotes. It seems to me it combines together a bunch of packages, so instead of naming 5 different footnote packages, you just name that one. Make index, of course, to make an index, and then BibTeX and BibLaTeX. It so happens that I don't need to use very much in the capabilities of these systems. I personally use BibLaTeX, but I don't know, I saw a presentation that I thought was a great presentation, so that's why I went with it. But certainly the question that people show up and ask is something like, I need a BibTeX or BibLaTeX style that does this. What should I do? And the answer is, I think first thing you do is you go to CTAN. There's, of course, a program that answers questions where you can build your own BibTeX style. But the first thing it seems to me you should go to do is log on to CTAN. This is a link to the CTAN, to the collection of BibTeX styles, and this is a link to the collection of BibLaTeX styles, and see if somebody else has already done it. That's what a beginner should do, seems to me. Special documents are document classes, so it's a little different than the packages. I use package as a single word for all of them, but anyway, often ask about how do you make exams or problem sets. People often say, I want to make up a list of problems and solutions for my studying, or I'm going to give my friend this, and he's going to give me a list. What should I use? CV, I mentioned in the presentation that I made last time in the 2019 presentation that very many people write in and say, I want to make a resume, or Vitas. What do I have to, what's the right thing to do? Very many people, as their first LaTeX document, are making a resume. Anyway, this is a good example where CTAN's tag system helps a person, because you can find packages that do what you're looking for it to do, and there's a good number of packages that do it. And of course, Beamer for presentations, and I'm using Beamer right here, so absolutely recommend. That's what a person should do. One more class of questions that folks often show up and ask, and that is about fonts. Not well enough known is the LaTeX font catalog. If you go there, it has copy and paste code to get a wide variety of different systems that don't look like everybody else's document, if that's what your goal is, and some very nice looking combinations. And then beyond that, of course, people often write in and say, I want to write a Vita, for example. I want to write a Vita, and I need to use this font that I have on my system for the Vita, not a mathematics document necessarily. What can I do? And so it seems to me that in that case, that just the knowledge that all you got to do is change the system call from PDF LaTeX document name to ZLaTeX document name, or else Lua LaTeX document name, is enough to give person some idea that this is absolutely doable, and this is sort of how to get started, and of course a link to the font spec package. Okay, so just to close here, I of course, when you make a list, you have to leave some things out. Maybe I left out some stuff that I should have put in. I'd appreciate feedback. That's absolutely right. In particular, people who are natural scientists mentioned the MH Chem package and the physics package, and I'm not a natural scientist. I haven't used them very much. It just seemed to me you have to draw the line somewhere. I drew the line here. I could be persuaded that I made a mistake. And someone else mentioned the memoir class, which is a wonderful class. Again, I just is it sort of the first thing that a person needs to know? Is it sort of in that pile of the things that you should print this out and stuff it in your book and have it? It didn't seem right to me, but maybe I'm wrong, and I absolutely could be persuaded. and then finally, the table packages. A lot of people talked about various table packages. People have favorite ones, for example, that aren't my favorite. But there, I could not, I could not live without such and such a package. And again, if somebody says to me, really, you missed the mark, you really should include such and such thing, I'd like to hear it. I'd like to be straightened out. So as I say, I'm very interested in feedback. I would appreciate being corrected on those things that I have not gotten right. Oh, I should say one more thing that I haven't mentioned. I haven't mentioned multilingual documents. Forgive me, I have no experience with multilingual documents, so I didn't include it. Maybe that was a mistake too. Okay. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation, and thank you very much. I look forward to seeing the other presentations also. Okay, so good day.